What would you do if the person you trusted most tried to erase you from existence? Sarah Mitchell thought she was going on a romantic yacht trip with her husband. She had no idea she was sailing toward her own murder. When the storm hit and the yacht began sinking, Sarah discovered the horrifying truth: her husband had been planning her death for months, and his mistress was there to watch it happen. But what Derek didn't count on was Sarah's will to survive. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and the ultimate revenge. If you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button now, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this ends. Let's dive in. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon seemed fitting as Sarah Mitchell's stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the Seattle skyline fade into gray. At 34, she had built TechFlow Solutions from a garage startup into a $500 million empire. But today felt different, heavy. The baby growing inside her seemed to sense her unease, shifting restlessly as she pressed her hand to her rounded belly. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had everything the world said she should want. The tailored maternity dress couldn't hide her success any more than the designer furniture could mask the long hours and sleepless nights that had built this kingdom. But success felt hollow when shared with ghosts of doubt that had been haunting her marriage for months. Derek had been distant lately, though he attributed it to work stress. Their conversations had become perfunctory exchanges about schedules and obligations rather than the intimate sharing of dreams they had once enjoyed. Sarah told herself it was normal, that pregnancy changed dynamics in every marriage. Still, the silence between them grew louder each day. "Mrs. Harrison, your husband is here," her assistant announced through the intercom. Sarah smiled despite her mood. Even after 3 years of marriage, Derek Harrison still made impromptu visits to her office, usually with some romantic gesture or surprise. She smoothed her navy maternity dress and walked to greet him, pushing aside the nagging voice that whispered about the credit card statements she had found, the late-night phone calls he took in private. Derek stood in her doorway, his tall frame impeccably dressed in his signature charcoal suit. His investment banking firm had handled TechFlow's IPO, and their professional relationship had blossomed into love, or so she had believed. Today, something in his smile seemed forced, rehearsed. "Hey, beautiful," Derek said, stepping forward to kiss her cheek. "How are my two favorite people doing?" Sarah leaned into his embrace, breathing in his familiar cologne, but underneath the expensive scent, she caught something else. A perfume that wasn't hers, floral and cloying. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to relax. Paranoia was just another pregnancy symptom, wasn't it? Tired, but good. "The baby's been active today," she said, watching Derek's face for any genuine warmth when he looked at her belly. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." Derek's hands rested on her shoulders, his blue eyes sparkling with what looked like excitement. "I've been thinking we need a baby moon, something special before our little one arrives. Derek, I have the product launch next month, and the board meeting." "Sarah." His voice was gentle but firm, the tone he used when closing difficult deals. "When's the last time you took a real break? You're 6 months pregnant and still working 12-hour days. This isn't just about you anymore." The words stung because they held truth, but also because of the subtle accusation underneath. As if her dedication to the company was somehow selfish, threatening to their unborn child. Sarah had built her identity around her work, around being the CEO who never slowed down. But carrying this child had changed something fundamental inside her. For the first time in her adult life, someone else's well-being mattered more than her next business milestone. "What did you have in mind?" she asked, studying the planes of his face, searching for the man she had fallen in love with. Derek's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A yacht, just the two of us, sailing up the coast for a long weekend. No phones, no emails, no board meetings, just us and the baby and the ocean." Sarah glanced back at her desk, covered with contracts and financial reports. The practical part of her mind cataloged everything that needed her attention. But Derek was right. After the baby came, everything would change. This might be their last chance for time alone together. Maybe it would help bridge whatever distance had grown between them. "The weather looks rough," she said, gesturing toward the darkening sky outside. "It'll pass," Derek assured her, his tone carrying an odd certainty. The forecast shows clear skies by Friday. Come on, Sarah, trust me. Something in his voice gave her pause, a note she couldn't quite identify. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw what appeared to be love and concern. Derek had never given her obvious reason to doubt him. He had been patient when she worked late, supportive during the stressful IPO process, and excited about the pregnancy from the moment she told him. Okay, what? She said finally. But just a long weekend. I need to be back by Tuesday for the investor presentation. Derek pulled her into his arms, spinning her gently around the office. You won't regret this, I promise. It'll be perfect. As Sarah laughed and felt the baby respond to their movement with a strong kick, she had no way of knowing that Derek's promise would prove devastatingly true. It would be perfect. For his plans, if not for hers. Outside, the storm clouds continued to gather, and in the reflection of the window, neither of them noticed the woman watching from the building across the street. Brooke Thompson lowered her binoculars and reached for her phone, her heart racing with anticipation. It's me, she said when Derek answered on the first ring. She said yes. We're really doing this. The line was quiet for a long moment before Derek's voice came through, cold and determined. Phase 1 complete. Now we move to Phase 2. 3 days later, Sarah stood on the dock at Elliott Bay Marina, watching Derek oversee the loading of their yacht, the Meridian. The 42-foot vessel gleamed white against the gray morning sky, its polished surfaces reflecting the choppy water below. Despite her earlier reservations about the weather, Sarah felt excitement building in her chest. When was the last time she and Derek had spent uninterrupted time together? The marina bustled with weekend activity, families preparing smaller boats for day trips, seasoned sailors checking rigging and weather reports, the constant background chorus of seagulls and lapping waves. Sarah breathed deeply, tasting salt air and freedom. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe this was exactly what their marriage needed. Mrs. Harrison. A young woman approached, wearing the crisp white uniform of the catering company. She was petite with honey blonde hair pulled back in a professional bun, her smile bright and efficient. Something about her seemed familiar, though Sarah couldn't place where they might have met. I'm Brooke from Coastal Catering. I'll be preparing your meals during the trip. Sarah frowned, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as the baby shifted. I thought Derek said it would just be the two of us. Last-minute addition, Derek called out from the yacht's deck, his voice carrying an undertone of mild irritation. I wanted to make sure you could relax completely. No cooking, no cleaning, just pure relaxation. The explanation made sense, and Sarah knew Derek's tendency toward grand gestures. But something about the young woman nagged at her. Maybe it was the way Brooke's eyes lingered on Derek with an intimacy that seemed unprofessional, or how her smile seemed to falter when she looked at Sarah's pregnant belly. The woman's posture was too familiar, too comfortable around Derek for someone he had supposedly just hired. That's very thoughtful, Sarah said, extending her hand while studying Brooke's face. I'm Sarah. I know exactly who you are, Brooke replied, her grip surprisingly firm and lasting a beat too long. I've followed your career closely. Very inspiring. Must be difficult balancing everything with a baby on the way. Something in the comment felt like a probe, as if Brooke were fishing for information about Sarah's state of mind or physical condition. Sarah's business instincts, honed by years of reading people across negotiation tables, began to sound quiet alarms. As they boarded the yacht, Sarah noticed Derek and Brooke exchange a quick glance. It wasn't the professional coordination between employer and service provider. It was the kind of look shared by people with secrets, loaded with meaning and unspoken communication. Professional coordination, Sarah told herself firmly, pushing down the growing unease. Nothing more. The first few hours on the water were everything Derek had promised. The morning clouds gave way to patches of blue sky, and the Puget Sound stretched endlessly ahead of them. Sarah lounged on the deck cushions, one hand on her belly, watching seabirds dive for fish while Derek piloted the yacht with practiced ease. The rhythm of the waves and the warmth of the sun began to ease the tension she had been carrying for weeks. You're a natural at this, she called to him over the sound of the engine, genuinely impressed by his confidence at the helm. Learn it from the best, Derek replied, his smile seeming more genuine than it had in months. My dad taught me to sail before I could drive, said every man should know how to read the water. It was a memory he had shared before, But Sarah never tired of hearing about Derek's childhood summers on Lake Washington. His father, a successful attorney, had insisted that his son learn practical skills alongside academic ones. Those lessons had shaped Derek into the confident, capable man she had fallen in love with, or thought she had. Brooke emerged from the galley carrying a tray of sandwiches and fresh fruit, moving with the easy balance of someone accustomed to boats. "Lunch is served," she announced, setting the tray on the small table beside Sarah with practiced efficiency. "This looks amazing," Sarah said, reaching for a sandwich while observing how Brooke anticipated exactly where to place everything. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble." "It's my pleasure," Puwaimon, Brooke replied, but her eyes were fixed on Derek with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Anything for you two. I want this weekend to be perfect." The emphasis on the word perfect seemed odd, as if it carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Sarah filed the observation away, her analytical mind automatically cataloging inconsistencies. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself studying Brooke more carefully. The young woman moved around the yacht with surprising familiarity, knowing exactly where everything was stored without having to search or ask. She anticipated Derek's needs before he voiced them, handing him tools and adjusting equipment without being asked. Her movements were choreographed, rehearsed. Most troubling was the way Brooke looked at Sarah when she thought no one was watching, not with the respectful deference expected from hired help, but with something that looked disturbingly like pity or calculation. When Sarah mentioned these observations to Derek during a quiet moment as they watched the sunset, he laughed it off with the easy charm that had first attracted her. "She's just very professional. The catering company must brief their staff thoroughly about each yacht. They probably sent her specs and photos." But even Derek's explanation felt rehearsed, as if he had been preparing for exactly this question. That night, as Sarah lay in the master cabin listening to the gentle rock of the boat at anchor, she heard voices on deck above. Derek and Brooke were talking in low tones, their words indistinct but their intimacy unmistakable. The conversation went on for over an hour, punctuated by what sounded like urgent whispers and long silences. Sarah told herself they were probably discussing tomorrow's meals or reviewing safety procedures. But her instincts, sharpened by years of detecting corporate deception, whispered otherwise. Still, sleep eluded her. The baby seemed restless too, shifting and kicking as if responding to her unease. Every time Sarah closed her eyes, she found herself remembering small details from the day. The way Brooke's hand had lingered on Derek's arm when passing him a drink. How Derek had smiled at Brooke with the same warm expression he usually reserved for Sarah. The casual familiarity between them that spoke of shared history, not recent introduction. By morning, the weather had turned. Gray clouds pressed low over the water, and the wind had picked up significantly. The yacht rocked more aggressively at anchor, and Sarah felt the first stirrings of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested over breakfast, watching Derek's face carefully. Derek checked the weather app on his phone, his expression unreadable. "The forecast shows this clearing up by afternoon. We can wait it out. Besides, we're committed now." The phrase hung in the air with ominous weight. Committed to what, exactly? But as Sarah watched him exchange another meaningful look with Brooke, she began to suspect that the weather was the least of her concerns. Sometimes the most dangerous storms are the ones you never see coming, the ones that build slowly in the hearts of the people you trust most, fed by secrets and lies until they become strong enough to destroy everything in their path. By noon, the storm had intensified beyond anything the weather forecast had predicted. The yacht pitched violently in the growing swells, and Sarah gripped the cabin railing as waves crashed over the bow. Her morning sickness, manageable on calm seas, had become overwhelming in the rough water. "Derek, we need to head for shore," she called out, her voice strained. "This isn't safe for the baby." Derek emerged from the navigation cabin, his hair disheveled by wind and spray, but instead of the concern she expected to see, his expression was oddly calm, almost relieved. "We're too far out now," he said. "Safer to ride it out here than risk the shallows near shore." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Since when are you an expert on storm navigation, Derek?" "I'm scared." "You should be." The voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to find Brooke standing in the cabin doorway, but the professional catering uniform was gone. Instead, she wore jeans and a waterproof jacket, Her blonde hair whipping freely in the wind, the subservient smile had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "What's going on?" Sarah's voice barely carried over the howling wind. Derek moved to stand beside Brooke, and Sarah's world began to crumble as she saw them together. Really together. The way Derek's hand found Brooke's waist, the shared look of anticipation in their eyes. The carefully maintained distance of the past 2 days had been an act. "How long?" Sarah whispered. "6 months." Brooke answered with cruel satisfaction. "Right around the time you started showing." The timeline hit Sarah like a physical blow. 6 months ago, Derek had become distant, claiming stress from work. 6 months ago, he had started working late and taking weekend business trips. 6 months ago, when Sarah had been glowing with early pregnancy, he had been building a life with another woman. "Derek, please," Sarah said, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. "Whatever this is, we can work through it." "The baby." "The baby is exactly the problem." Derek cut her off, his voice sharp with frustration. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me? Sarah, what your precious company and your perfect little family have cost me?" Sarah's mind reeled. "Cost you, Derek. You've benefited from everything I've built. The house, the lifestyle, all of it controlled by your prenup." Derek snarled. "I manage your IP man, make you millions, and what do I get? A salary and the privilege of living in your shadow." The prenup. Sarah's lawyer had insisted on it, protecting the assets she had built before marriage. At the time, Derek had seemed understanding, even supportive. He had his own successful career, his own financial security, or so she had believed. "I don't understand," Sarah said, but even as the words left her mouth, pieces began falling into place. Derek's recent obsession with the business finances, his questions about her will and life insurance policies, the way he had pushed for this yacht trip despite the weather warnings. "Let me help you understand," Brooke said, stepping closer. "Your husband has been living beyond his means for years, gambling on cryptocurrency, making bad investments, trying to prove he's as successful as his brilliant wife. That's not," Sarah started. "2.3 million, Derek said quietly. "That's what I owe to some very unforgiving people. People who don't care about my marriage or your pregnancy or any of it." Sarah felt the yacht lurch beneath her feet, but the physical motion was nothing compared to the way her world was tilting. "So you decided to kill me?" "I decided to solve a problem," Derek replied. "With you gone, I inherit everything. The shared assets, the life insurance, even a portion of tech flow through your will, more than enough to pay my debts and start fresh." "Bush with her," Sarah said, looking at Brooke. "Brooke understands ambition," Derek said. "She understands that sometimes you have to take what you want instead of waiting for someone to give it to you." Thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah realized that the storm raging outside was nothing compared to the one that had been building in her marriage. Every loving gesture, every supportive word, every moment of intimacy had been performed by a man who was planning her death. "You're both insane," Sarah said, backing toward the cabin door. "People will ask questions. The Coast Guard will investigate." "Tragic accident," Brooke interrupted. "Young pregnant woman, overcome by morning sickness, falls overboard during a storm. Her devastated husband tried everything to save her, but the sea was too rough." Derek nodded toward the yacht's equipment. "The GPS shows we're 15 miles offshore. The water temperature is 52 degrees. Even if you're a strong swimmer, you won't last more than 20 minutes. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized they had thought of everything. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of desperation. This was a calculated murder, planned down to the smallest detail. As another wave crashed over the deck, soaking them all in icy spray, Sarah understood that her fight for survival was about to begin. But she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the innocent life growing inside her, a life that Derek was willing to sacrifice for money and freedom. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of betrayal and greed that had been brewing in the hearts of the two people she had trusted most. Sarah's mind raced as she backed toward the cabin, her hands gripping the railing for support. The yacht pitched violently in the storm, but her focus remained fixed on Derek and Brooke. Their calm demeanor in the face of what they were planning chilled her more than the icy spray soaking through her clothes. "Derek," Think about what you're doing, Sarah pleaded, playing for time while scanning for escape routes. This is your child. Our child. Is it? Derek's question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying that for someone who supposedly loves me, you certainly didn't seem interested in intimacy once you got pregnant. Derek said, always too tired, too stressed, too focused on work. That's normal during pregnancy, Sarah protested. You know that, Brooke laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Normal for women who don't have anything to hide. The implication hit Sarah like a slap. They were questioning the paternity of her child, creating another justification for their planned murder. The cruelty of it took her breath away. You're sick, Sarah whispered. Both of you. Aunt Derek's expression hardened. I'm practical. Do you know what it's like being married to someone who makes more in a month than I make in a year? Living in a house I can't afford. Driving cars registered in your name. Attending parties where everyone knows I'm just Sarah Mitchell's husband. I never made you feel that way, Sarah said. But doubt crept into her voice. Had she been so focused on her success that she missed Derek's growing resentment? You didn't have to, Derek replied. It was written on everyone's faces. The investors who barely acknowledged me at our own anniversary party, the board members who discussed business around me like I was furniture. Even your assistant treats me like an inconvenience. Sarah realized with growing horror that Derek's wounds ran deeper than money. His pride, his sense of masculine identity, had been slowly eroding throughout their marriage. But instead of talking to her about it, he had chosen betrayal and murder. So this is about your ego, Sarah said. This is about survival. Brooke interjected. Derek was drowning in debt and self-pity when I found him. I showed him a way out. You showed him how to become a killer. Brooke shrugged. I showed him how to take control of his life. Another massive wave crashed over the yacht, and Sarah felt the boat shudder beneath the impact. Water poured across the deck, and she noticed with alarm that the yacht seemed to be sitting lower in the water than before. What have you done to the boat? Sarah demanded. Derek and Brooke exchanged a look, and Sarah saw the answer in their eyes before Derek spoke. Insurance investigators looked closely at unexplained sinkings. Derek said, but if a pregnant woman falls overboard during a storm, and her husband has to abandon ship to search for her, well, that's just a tragic series of events. You sabotaged it, Sarah breathed. Small holes drilled below the waterline, Brooke confirmed. Nothing dramatic, just enough to ensure the yacht goes down after you do. Derek will escape in the emergency raft, traumatized and alone. Sarah's legs felt weak. The yacht was sinking beneath them, and her husband had planned every detail of her death. But as the reality of her situation sank in, something else began to rise within her. Anger, pure, focused rage at the two people who thought they could erase her and her child for money. You made one mistake, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Really? Derek asked. What's that? You underestimated me. Before they could react, Sarah lunged for the emergency kit mounted near the cabin door. Her fingers found the flare gun just as Derek started toward her. She raised it with both hands, pointing it directly at his chest. Stay back, she warned. Derek halted, but his expression remained confident. Sarah, you're not a killer. No, Sarah agreed, but I am a mother protecting her child. For the first time since the confrontation began, she saw uncertainty flicker in Derek's eyes. Brooke stepped closer to him, her face pale. She won't do it, Brooke said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the flare gun steady. The yacht continued to sink beneath them, listing noticeably to starboard now. Time was running out, but she had bought herself a moment to think. The emergency radio was mounted on the far side of the cabin, but reaching it would mean lowering the flare gun. The life raft was on deck, but deploying it would take precious minutes. And all the while, the yacht was settling deeper into the stormy sea. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the wind and rain. You're going to help me launch the life raft, and we're all going to survive this. Then you're going to explain to the authorities exactly what you plan to do. Derek laughed bitterly. And then would I go to prison? Lose everything anyway. Then you face the consequences of your choices like an adult. Sarah shot back. But even as she spoke, Sarah could see in Derek's eyes that he had moved beyond the point of rational thought. Desperation had taken hold, and desperate people were capable of anything. The yacht shuddered again, and Sarah felt her feet slip on the wet deck. In that moment of distraction, Derek lunged forward, and everything Sarah thought she knew about survival was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Derek's weight slammed into Sarah with the force of desperation. The flare gun flew from her hands, skittering across the wet deck as they crashed against the cabin wall. Sarah cried out as Derek's shoulder drove into her ribs, her pregnant belly vulnerable and exposed. "Derek, stop," she gasped, but his hands were already around her wrists, pinning her against the cold fiberglass. "It's too late for stopping," Derek snarled, his face inches from hers. "Too late for everything except finishing this." Sarah drove her knee upward, connecting with Derek's stomach. He doubled over with a grunt of pain, and she broke free, scrambling toward the flare gun. But Brooke was faster, kicking the weapon over the side of the yacht before Sarah could reach it. "No more games," Brooke said coldly. The yacht lurched sickeningly to one side, and Sarah realized with terror that they had minutes, maybe less, before the vessel went under completely. The sabotaged hull was taking on water faster than the pumps could handle, and the storm was driving them farther from shore with each passing moment. "The life raft," Sarah pleaded, pointing toward the emergency equipment. "We need to deploy it now, or we'll all die." "That was always the plan," Derek said, straightening up and wiping blood from his split lip. "For you, anyway." Sarah's mind reeled as the full scope of their plan became clear. They intended to let her drown while they escaped in the life raft, playing the part of tragic survivors who had lost everything trying to save her. The perfect murder, disguised as heroic failure. Water was pouring over the deck now, and Sarah felt the yacht beginning its final descent. In desperation, she lunged for the emergency radio, but Derek caught her around the waist, his arms like iron bands around her body. "Let me go." Sarah struggled against his grip, but Derek was stronger, and her pregnant body was clumsy and off balance. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," Derek said, and for a moment his voice held a trace of the man she had fallen in love with. "But I can't see another way out?" "There's always another way," Sarah gasped, but even as she spoke, she felt the yacht's deck tilting beneath her feet. They were going down. Brooke was already working to deploy the life raft, her movements efficient and practiced. She had clearly rehearsed this moment, planned for every contingency except one. She hadn't planned on Sarah fighting back. With a surge of maternal fury, Sarah drove her elbow backward into Derek's solar plexus. His grip loosened just enough for her to twist free, and she threw herself toward the yacht's side. If she was going into the water, it would be on her terms, not theirs. "Sarah, no," Derek's shout followed her as she hit the railing, but Sarah was already committed. She vaulted over the side of the sinking yacht, plunging into the black, churning water below. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and shocking her system into survival mode. Above her, she could hear Brooke screaming at Derek. "You idiot, she was supposed to fall, not jump. Now it looks like suicide." Sarah kicked frantically, trying to stay afloat in the heavy swells. Her waterlogged clothes dragged at her limbs, and the baby's weight threw off her center of gravity. Every wave that crashed over her head drove her deeper beneath the surface, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each struggle back to air. The yacht's lights were fading as the vessel disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it any evidence of what Derek and Brooke had planned. In the darkness, Sarah could barely make out the orange glow of the deployed life raft, already 50 yards away and moving farther with each wave. "Help!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was lost in the howling wind. She watched in horror as the life raft drifted away, carrying Derek and Brooke to safety while she fought for her life in the freezing water. They had won. Despite everything, they had won. But even as hypothermia began to set in, even as her limbs grew heavy and numb, Sarah refused to give up. The baby inside her was depending on her strength, her will to survive. She couldn't let Derek's betrayal be the end of their story. Sarah forced herself to float on her back, conserving energy while scanning the horizon for any sign of rescue. The storm was beginning to ease slightly, and in the distance, she thought she saw a light. A boat, perhaps, or maybe just wishful thinking. born of desperation. But as the cold water closed over her face once again, Sarah clung to that distant glimmer of hope. Because sometimes, when everything you've trusted proves false, hope is the only truth left. And sometimes, hope is enough. Captain Jack Reynolds had been fishing these waters for 30 years, and he knew when the sea was trying to tell him something. The storm had been fierce but brief, the kind that blew through the sound like an angry spirit before moving on to torment someone else. But as he guided his fishing vessel through the aftermath, scanning for debris that might damage his nets, something caught his eye, a flash of orange in the gray water. At first, he thought it might be a buoy broke loose from someone's crab pot, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his blood run cold. A life raft, occupied by two people who were very much alive and apparently unharmed. Jack cut his engine and called out across the water, "You folks okay? Need assistance?" The man in the raft waved frantically. "Thank God our yacht went down in the storm. My pregnant wife fell overboard. Have you seen anyone else in the water?" Jack's experienced eye took in the scene quickly. Two people in a life raft, dry clothes, no signs of distress beyond the emotional. If their yacht had gone down recently enough for the woman to still be alive, these two should be wet, hypothermic, showing signs of exposure. "How long since she went in?" Jack called back. 20 minutes, maybe 30, the blonde woman replied. "We've been searching, but the current, Jack nodded grimly. 30 minutes in 50-degree water meant the woman was either dead or very close to it. But something nagged at him about the couple's story. In 30 years of rescue operations, he had learned to trust his instincts. And right now, those instincts were screaming. "I'll take you aboard and call the Coast Guard," Jack said. "But first, I'm going to do a search pattern. If she's still out there—" "She's gone," the man said, his voice breaking. "I failed her. I failed them both." The grief seemed genuine, but Jack noticed how the blonde woman's hand rested possessively on the man's arm, how her eyes kept scanning the horizon not with hope, but with what looked like concern. As Jack maneuvered to bring the life raft alongside his vessel, a flash of color in his peripheral vision caught his attention. There, barely visible in the trough between two swells, was something that definitely wasn't debris. It was a person, floating face up, arms moving weakly in what looked like a desperate attempt to stay conscious. "Son of a—" Jack cut the engines and grabbed his life ring. "Hold on," he shouted across the water. The woman in the life raft went rigid. "What is it?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew. Jack didn't answer. He was already over the side of his boat, swimming hard toward the figure in the water. As he got closer, he could see it was indeed a pregnant woman, her lips blue with cold, her movements growing weaker by the second. "I got you," Jack said as he reached her, slipping the life ring around her body. "You're going to be okay." The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. "My baby," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Baby's fine," Jack assured her, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "Let's get you out of this water." As he swam back toward his boat, towing the semi-conscious woman behind him, Jack could hear urgent voices from the life raft. The man was shouting something about not understanding, about how this was impossible. The blonde woman's voice was sharper, more controlled, but Jack caught fragments that chilled him more than the cold water. "Stick to the story. Accident. No one will believe." By the time Jack hauled the pregnant woman onto his boat and wrapped her in emergency blankets, the pieces were starting to fall into place. The woman in his arms was hypothermic but alive. The two in the life raft were dry, warm, and very worried about something other than rescue. "What's your name, honey?" Jack asked the woman as he radioed for Coast Guard assistance. "Sarah," she managed through blue lips. "Sarah Mitchell." Jack's eyebrows shot up. He recognized the name from business news. But more importantly, he recognized the fear in her eyes as she looked toward the life raft. "Those people," Sarah whispered, so quietly only Jack could hear. "They tried. My husband tried to kill me." Jack's jaw tightened. In 30 years on the water, he had seen a lot of things, but attempted murder was a new one. He keyed his radio again, this time using a different frequency. "Coast Guard Sector Seattle, this is fishing vessel Persistence," he said. "I need immediate assistance for a possible maritime crime scene. and I need you to treat this as an active investigation." As Sarah's body temperature slowly returned to normal and the Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon, Jack found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that bring people together. The storm that was meant to cover up a murder had instead delivered the victim into the hands of someone who would believe her story. But Jack also knew that survival was just the first battle. Now Sarah would have to prove what had happened to her, of course, and the two people in the life raft were already working on their version of events. The real fight was just beginning. Detective Linda Carter had seen her share of maritime accidents, but something about this case felt wrong from the moment she stepped aboard the Coast Guard cutter. Two scenarios, two stories, and three people whose versions of events didn't quite align. In the medical bay, Sarah Mitchell lay wrapped in thermal blankets. Her core temperature was slowly returning to normal. Her story was consistent. Her husband and his mistress had sabotaged their yacht and tried to murder her for insurance money. The details were specific, the timeline clear, her emotional responses appropriate for someone who had survived attempted murder. On deck, Derek Harrison sat with his head in his hands while Brooke Thompson rubbed his shoulders comfortingly. Their story was simpler, a tragic accident during a storm, a desperate search for his beloved wife, the guilt of a man who couldn't save the woman he loved. "Mr. Harrison," Detective Carter said, pulling up a chair across from the couple, "I need to go through the events one more time." Derek looked up, his eyes red with what appeared to be genuine tears. "I keep thinking there was something more I could have done, some way I could have saved her. Tell me about the yacht's condition before you left port." "Perfect," Derek replied without hesitation. "I had it inspected last month. The mechanic said everything was in excellent condition." Brooke nodded supportively. Derek is very meticulous about safety, especially with Sarah being pregnant. "And Ms. Thompson, you were aboard as catering staff." "That's right." Derek wanted Sarah to be able to relax completely. No cooking, no cleaning, just rest. Detective Carter made notes, comparing their responses to the preliminary statement she had taken from Sarah. The stories diverged on almost every point. According to Sarah, Brooke had been Derek's mistress for 6 months. According to Derek, he had never seen Brooke before the day they departed. "Mrs. Mitchell seems to believe you and her husband are romantically involved," Carter said to Brooke. Brooke's face showed perfect surprise and disgust. That's horrible. She's clearly traumatized. Maybe the hypothermia affected her thinking. Hypothermia can cause confusion." Derek agreed quickly. "Hallucinations, paranoid thoughts. I read about it online while we were waiting for rescue." Carter nodded non-committally. It was a plausible explanation, except for one problem. Sarah's story included details that someone with hypothermia-induced confusion wouldn't be able to maintain consistently. Financial specifics, timeline details, conversations that included exact quotes. "Mr. Harrison, can you tell me about your financial situation?" For the first time, Derek hesitated. "I'm sorry. Your wife mentioned some gambling debts, cryptocurrency investments that went bad." Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sarah worries about money. She's very conservative financially. Any investment that doesn't guarantee a return makes her nervous." "So you don't have any significant debts?" "Nothing unusual for someone in my profession. A mortgage, car payments, the normal things." Carter made another note. It would be easy enough to verify Derek's financial records, assuming she could get a warrant, but she was already forming a theory about what had really happened on that yacht. "I'd like to speak with each of you separately," Carter said, "just to make sure we have all the details clear." She started with Brooke, taking her to a quiet corner of the cutter's bridge, away from Derek's supportive presence. The young woman seemed less confident. "Ms. Thompson, how long have you worked for the catering company?" "About 8 months," Brooke replied. "And before that, I was between jobs. The economy." "You know," Carter nodded sympathetically. "It must be difficult, finding steady work, especially when you're trying to maintain a certain lifestyle." Brooke's eyes flickered. "I'm sorry, the clothes you're wearing, designer jeans, expensive jacket, that's a $2,000 watch on your wrist. Pretty nice for someone who works part-time catering gigs." I save my money carefully." "I'm sure you do." Carter leaned forward slightly. "Miss Thompson, if Mr. Harrison was paying you for something other than catering services, Now would be the time to tell me, before this gets more complicated. For a moment, Brooke's carefully constructed mask slipped. Carter saw calculation in her eyes, the rapid assessment of options that guilty people make when they realize their story is falling apart. But then the mask snapped back into place. I don't know what you're implying, detective, but I was hired to cater this trip. Nothing more. Mr. Harrison is a grieving husband who just lost his wife in a terrible accident. Except his wife isn't dead, Carter pointed out. Thank God for that, Brooke said quickly. But she's clearly confused about what happened. Trauma can do that to people. Carter finished the interview knowing she was dealing with accomplished liars. But she also knew that lies had a way of unraveling under pressure, especially when the people telling them started to panic. And as she watched Derek and Brooke through the bridge windows, she could see the first signs of panic beginning to set in. They were whispering urgently to each other, their body language tense and defensive. The performance was good, but it wasn't perfect. And in Carter's experience, imperfection was where the truth always revealed itself. Within hours of reaching shore, Derek Harrison's carefully orchestrated plan began to unravel. What he hadn't counted on was Detective Carter's methodical approach to investigation, or the fact that attempted murder leaves traces that are difficult to erase. The first crack appeared when Carter pulled Derek's financial records. $2.3 million in debt was hard to hide, especially when the creditors included some of Seattle's less legitimate lending operations. Phone records showed dozens of calls to offshore gambling sites and cryptocurrency exchanges, painting a picture of a man spiraling into financial ruin. The second crack came from the yacht itself. Coast Guard divers had located the Meridian in 40 feet of water, and their preliminary report confirmed Sarah's story. Small holes had been deliberately drilled in the hull, disguised to look like normal wear, but clearly the work of someone with access to marine tools. But it was the third crack that proved fatal to Derek's deception. The catering company had no record of Brooke Thompson ever working for them. In fact, they had no record of being hired for any yacht trip that weekend. Mr. Harrison, Detective Carter said as she entered the interview room where Derek had been waiting for 2 hours. We need to talk. Derek looked up from his hands, his face a mask of grief that was beginning to show strain around the edges. Have you found out anything more about what happened to Sarah? Is she going to be okay? Your wife is going to be fine, Carter replied, settling into the chair across from him. But I'm more interested in talking about what happened before she ended up in the water. I've told you everything I remember. Have you? Carter opened a file and spread several documents across the table, because these paint a very different picture of your weekend plans. Derek's eyes flicked over the papers. Financial records, phone logs, the Coast Guard's preliminary report on the yacht. His face remained composed, but Carter saw his hands tremble slightly. I don't understand what you're showing me. Let me help you understand. Carter pointed to the financial statements. You owe $2.3 million to various creditors. Some of them are the kind of people who don't accept late payments gracefully. Derek's jaw tightened. Everyone has debts. Detective, that doesn't mean... It means you had motive, Carter interrupted. Motive to commit insurance fraud. Motive to kill your wife. That's insane. I love Sarah. Carter pulled out another document. This is your wife's life insurance policy. $5 million. With you as the sole beneficiary. Combined with the community property from your marriage, you'd inherit enough to pay your debts and start fresh. Lots of couples have life insurance. Not many of them sabotage their own yachts. Carter slid the Coast Guard report across the table. Care to explain how those holes got drilled in your yacht's hull? For the first time, Derek's composure cracked completely. His face went pale, and he stared at the report as if it might burst into flames. There must be some mistake. Maybe the storm damage. Storm damage doesn't create perfectly round holes with tool marks around the edges. Carter said, someone with marine construction experience did this. Someone who knew exactly where to drill to sink the yacht slowly. Derek's breathing became shallow and rapid. The walls of his deception were closing in, and Carter could see panic setting in. I want a lawyer, Derek said finally. That's your right, Carter agreed. But before you make that call, you should know that Ms. Thompson is in the next room, and she's very eager to tell us her side of the story. It was a bluff. Brooke was actually questioned by another detective. And so far she was sticking to her story. But Derek didn't know that, and the mention of his co-conspirator sent him over the edge. She was supposed to, Derek started, then caught himself. She was supposed to what? Mr. Harrison. Derek closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging in defeat. When he opened them again, the mask of the grieving husband was gone, replaced by something desperate and cornered. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," he said quietly. "The people I owed money to. They weren't going to wait much longer. They were talking about sending messages, hurting Sarah to get to me." Carter leaned forward. "So you decided to hurt her first?" "I thought if she just disappeared, it would solve everything. The debts would be paid, she wouldn't be in danger anymore, and I could start over." "With Brooke Thompson and—" Derek nodded miserably. "Brooke understood what I was going through. She didn't judge me for the mistakes I'd made. She helped you plan to murder your pregnant wife." The words hung in the air like an accusation from which there was no escape. Derek buried his face in his hands, and Carter heard the sound of a man's entire world collapsing. "I never meant for it to go this far," Derek whispered. "It was supposed to be quick, clean. She wasn't supposed to suffer." Carter felt a mix of satisfaction and disgust as she read Derek his rights. The confession would make the prosecution's case airtight, but it wouldn't erase what Sarah had been through. Some betrayals cut too deep to ever fully heal, but at least justice would be served. And sometimes, Carter reflected, that was the best outcome anyone could hope for. The courtroom was packed with reporters, investors, and employees from TechFlow Solutions. Sarah Mitchell had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of survival against impossible odds. As she took the witness stand, 6 months pregnant and radiating quiet strength, the packed gallery fell silent. Prosecutor Janet Walsh approached the witness stand with respectful determination. "Mrs. Mitchell, can you tell the court about the morning you departed on what you believed was a romantic weekend with your husband?" Sarah's voice was steady as she recounted the events. The surprise yacht trip, Brooke's presence as supposed catering staff, the growing unease she had felt as the weekend progressed. Her testimony was detailed and consistent, painting a picture of a woman who had trusted completely and been betrayed absolutely. "When did you first realize your husband intended to harm you?" Walsh asked. "When the storm hit, and instead of seeking shelter, Derek seemed almost relieved by the dangerous conditions." Sarah replied. "Then Brooke dropped her act, and they told me exactly what they had planned." Derek sat at the defense table, his expensive suit unable to hide the fact that he had aged years in the months since his arrest. His lawyer had advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, but Derek's pride had insisted on a trial. Now, listening to his wife's calm recitation of his crimes, he seemed to finally understand the magnitude of what he had lost. "Mrs. Mitchell," the defense attorney said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you and your husband were having marital problems, that the pregnancy had put strain on your relationship?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Every marriage has challenges," she said finally, "but I believe we were working through ours together. I had no idea Derek was planning to murder me instead." The defense attorney pressed on. "You've testified that you suspected your husband was having an affair. Why didn't you confront him directly?" "Because I hoped I was wrong," Sarah replied, her hand resting protectively on her now prominent belly. "Because I loved him, and I wanted to believe the best of him. That trust nearly cost me and my child our lives." When Brooke Thompson took the stand, her testimony provided the final pieces of the prosecution's case. Facing her own charges and the possibility of decades in prison, she had decided to cooperate fully with the authorities. "Derek approached me about 6 months into their marriage," Brooke testified. "He was frustrated about living in Sarah's shadow, about the prenup that limited his access to her wealth. When his gambling debts mounted, he started talking about what life would be like if Sarah wasn't in the picture." "Did you encourage these fantasies?" Prosecutor Walsh asked. Brooke's face flushed with shame. "I thought he was just venting. But then he started researching maritime accidents, asking questions about insurance payouts. When I realized he was serious, I should have walked away." "But you didn't—" "No," Brooke whispered. "I was in love with him, and I convinced myself that Sarah was the problem, that if she was gone, Derek and I could be happy together." The most damaging testimony came from Derek's financial advisor, who revealed the full extent of his client's debts and poor decisions. Phone records showed extensive communication with offshore gambling operations and high-risk investment schemes. Bank records revealed cash withdrawals that aligned with payments to loan sharks and underground betting operations. Mr. Harrison had lost control of his finances completely, the advisor testified. He was facing bankruptcy, possible criminal charges for some of his investment activities, and threats from creditors who don't typically resolve disputes through legal channels. When the prosecution rested its case, Derek's defense attorney made a half-hearted attempt to portray his client as a man driven to desperation by circumstances beyond his control. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Derek's own confession to Detective Carter had been captured on video. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty, the foreman announced. Sarah closed her eyes as the verdict was read, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. Justice wouldn't undo Derek's betrayal or erase the trauma of that night on the yacht, but it provided closure to a chapter of her life she was ready to close. Derek showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs, but Sarah caught his eye for one final moment. She saw no remorse there, only the bitter resentment of a man who blamed everyone but himself for his downfall. Brooke received a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation, but 15 years in federal prison would give her plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led her to this moment. As Sarah left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and facing a barrage of camera flashes, she felt the baby kick strongly inside her, a reminder that some endings are also beginnings, and that survival is just the first step toward rebuilding a life worth living. The storm that had nearly destroyed her had also swept away the lies and deceptions that had been poisoning her marriage. Now, finally, she could see clearly again, 2 years after the trial. Sarah Mitchell stood on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter, watching the Seattle skyline recede as they headed out into Puget Sound. But this wasn't a pleasure cruise or a romantic getaway. This was the maiden voyage of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation's new partnership with the Coast Guard, providing maritime safety training for domestic violence survivors. "Ready for this?" Captain Jack Reynolds asked, joining her at the railing. His weathered face showed the same steady calm that had saved her life during the storm. Sarah smiled, adjusting the life jacket around her 18-month-old daughter Emma, who was strapped securely to her chest in a carrier. More than ready. The foundation had grown from Sarah's need to transform her trauma into something meaningful, using the settlement from Derek's assets and her own resources. She had created programs that taught survival skills to women escaping abusive relationships. The maritime program was just one component, but it held special significance for Sarah. "Mommy, boat," Emma declared, pointing at a passing ferry with the enthusiasm only toddlers could muster. "That's right, baby," Sarah said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "We're on a boat too." Jack had become more than the man who saved her life. Over the months of recovery and rebuilding, their friendship had deepened into something neither of them had expected. He understood her need to heal at her own pace, never pushing, always present when she needed support. Their wedding 6 months ago had been small and private, held on a bluff overlooking the water where he had first pulled her from the waves. Emma, about 8, had worn a tiny life jacket as she toddled down the aisle, scattering flower petals with serious concentration. "Contact bearing 270. One of the Coast Guard crew called out. "Vessel in distress." Sarah and Jack exchanged glances. Training exercises sometimes involved real emergencies, and both of them had learned that the sea didn't respect schedules or plans. "Let's go," Jack said, but Sarah was already moving toward the bridge. The vessel in distress turned out to be a pleasure craft with engine trouble, nothing dramatic or dangerous. But as Sarah watched the Coast Guard crew execute a textbook assistance operation, she felt a deep satisfaction. This was why the foundation mattered. Not every emergency on the water involved betrayal or murder, but knowing how to respond, how to survive, how to help others. Those skills could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. "Mrs. Reynolds," one of the trainees said, approaching Sarah after the exercise was complete. "I wanted to thank you for this program. After what my ex-husband put me through, I never thought I'd feel safe on the water again." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. "The goal isn't to forget what happened to us," she said. "It's to make sure it doesn't define what happens next." As the cutter headed back to port, Sarah found herself thinking about Derek, now serving his sentence in federal prison. She had heard through lawyers that he was teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates, perhaps finding some small measure of redemption in helping others avoid his mistakes. Brooke had been released after serving 8 years of her sentence, disappearing into witness protection after testifying against some of Derek's more dangerous creditors. Sarah felt no animosity toward either of them anymore. Anger was too heavy a burden to carry while building a new life. "Penny for your thoughts," Jack said, slipping his arm around her waist as they watched the lights of Seattle grow brighter in the gathering dusk. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth. "2 years ago, I thought my life was over. Now, now you're changing the world, one survivor at a time," Jack finished. Emma stirred in her carrier, making the soft sounds that meant she was getting hungry. Sarah smiled, knowing that soon they'd be home. Safe in the harbor Jack had helped her build from the wreckage of her old life. The storm that had nearly destroyed her had also taught her something valuable. Sometimes the only way to find solid ground is to first learn how to stay afloat in deep water. And sometimes the person who saves you becomes the person you choose to build a future with. As the Coast Guard cutter tied up at the dock, Sarah felt Emma's tiny hand grasp her finger with surprising strength. Another generation. Another chance to get things right. The cycle of trust and betrayal that had nearly cost Sarah everything would end with her. Emma would grow up knowing that survival was possible, that justice existed, and that love didn't have to come with the price of giving up who you are. The sea that had once been Sarah's enemy had become her teacher, and the lessons it taught were simple but profound. Weather the storm. Help others navigate troubled waters. And never underestimate the power of hope to keep you afloat when everything else fails. In the distance, a lighthouse beam swept across the water, guiding other vessels safely home. Sarah smiled, knowing that she had become a lighthouse too. Her story a beacon for anyone lost in their own storm, showing them that it was possible to find safe harbor on the other side of betrayal. The waves lapped gently against the dock, whispering promises of calm seas and fair winds ahead.